Did he take you out to dinner?
No, he didn't take me out to dinner. I met Alan a few years later. I met Alan I've known Alan quite a long time. I had known him during the 2000 AD years from, I started working drawing for 2000 AD in 1977, and he was a bit of a latecomer. He must have started 2 or 3 years, 3 or 4 years later, I should think. So I met him round about that time at a convention. He was there were 2 guys came up to see me. Both of them were called Moore. There was a tall, hairy one and a shorter one, Steve Moore. Both of them were comic book writers. I'd never heard of either of them. But ever since then, Alan and I were quite good friends, and he became such a terrific writer. We just weren't expecting this hairy guy to turn into such a clever writer. I don't know whether you read any of his stories in 2000 AD. He was writing Halo Jones, and there was one called Time Twisters. Have you ever heard of those? Dave Gibbons drew the pictures on those ones, and they were very, very good. So Alan and I were good friends at the time, and we narrowly missed working with each other a few times prior to The Killing Joke. Titan Books started doing books and comics, and they were thinking of doing a line of comic books, and they were going to get Alan Moore to write most of them, and a lot of the 2000 AD artists to draw them. And I was lined up to do one called Rocket Rake there, which was going to be a really sort of scathing mistake of the all-American comic book hero. That didn't come off. But I always found him a really sort of a sweet guy, a very nice guy to work with. As far as The Killing Joke was concerned, because we knew each other, we were always destined to do something together. And I was the one who really wanted to do a graphic novel about the Joker. Dick Giordano asked me what I'd like to do, and I said I'd like to do a graphic novel about the Joker, and I'd love it if Alan Moore wrote it. And Alan just seemed quite happy to come along and do it. I'm not sure he was particularly invested in the project, really. He just had a falling out with DC about Watchmen, something to do with the merchandising, I think. But when we actually got started on the whole thing, he just went away, wrote the story, and presented me with this mammoth script. And I got on and drew it.
It was something like 128 pages.
I'm sure it was.
For a 48-page book.
I think so. The first panel took 2 pages to describe.
There was another question from the crowd about if you had planned to do any sequential interiors, if you had any plans for books of that kind, anything that you'd wanted to work on or had hoped to work in the future.
Well, I was meaning to do new interior stories. I have certain stories I have in mind that I plan to write. After working with Alan Moore, I found it very difficult to take like a backward step and work with some other writer. I mean, that's kind of a little bit precious. I'm sure there are some very, very good writers around. But I became more and more determined to control as much of what I did as possible. To the point where I didn't really want anyone else to colour. I don't want anyone else to ink my work, certainly, and I don't want anyone else to colour it. So I'm sort of controlling the penciling, the inking, the colouring. And I also wanted to only draw stuff that I wrote myself. Not because I consider myself to be a writer, but because I know what I want to draw. And there is the old thing in comics where, you know, you sit down to work one day, the comic book artist, and you get the script, and the script says, panel 1, man gets out of taxi on busy London street. And you think, how long did it take for the writer to write that panel, but how long is it going to take me to draw it? You know, you know that there are terrific images as an artist that you can come up with, but the writer is never going to provide you with the ability to do that. It's only oneself that can know what sort of images would look good if you draw them.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You have a question?
I only know your work from 2008
That's right. Well, I've got a sort of a superstition about Marvel. It goes right back to the fact that I was a rabid DC collector and fan as a kid. You know, I still have my collection of DC comics, and I just love the DC characters. I didn't really collect Marvel comics at all, with the exception of, I could give you a list actually. I've got all the Silver Surfers, and I loved Howard the Duck.
And you wound up doing a Howard the Duck piece for Marvel. You wound up creating a Howard the Duck piece.
Well, I did a couple. I did 2 covers that had Howard the Duck. One was a She-Hulk cover, but I don't know whether it's because I wasn't a Marvel fan, but since then, whenever I've done just a few things for Marvel, those things have always been jinxed, in as much as the first Marvel image I ever drew was for a British Marvel reprint book, and I did a Hulk cover. And when I saw the thing in print, they'd stuck a John Buscema Hulk head over the top of my head, because my head wasn't adequately like the Hulk. That was the first bad feeling I had, and after that, things for Marvel were either rejected, they turned up late. I mean, I'm notorious for getting my work in late, and I had this sense that Marvel were just not going to tolerate that kind of behaviour at all. So I've had a kind of a feeling that maybe me and Marvel are not going to get on. I think I really ought to get over it, because I'm sure I've missed a lot of opportunities there.
There was that Spider-Man piece that you did as well. It was supposed to be a cover.
Yes, that's right, another one. A Spider-Man cover ended up on the inside.
It wound up being a pin-up. They wound up cancelling the title after you did the cover, and then putting it in as a pin-up on the back page.
Yes. I mean, when I did the She-Hulk cover, the one with it, there was She-Hulk and Howard the Duck on it. That turned up, as far as I know, a day late. And because it was late, they thought, we've got to get this book done on time. So they have the bullpen, I think, at Marvel. They have a bunch of artists who apparently sit around at Marvel and do things really quickly. And they took my rough, the one that I'd sent in the mail, of what I was going to provide for the cover, and they got someone in the bullpen to just finish it off, really, and that was the one that ended up on the cover. And I think my artwork turned up the next day, and they put that out as a kind of a one-off cover that didn't have a comic book behind it. I think it was sort of sitting around free on the place where you paid for the comics. But anyway, me and Marvel have not quite hit it off so far.
I know there's some people in the audience that are aspiring artists that probably want to hear about your process, or your the way you transitioned from British comics into American comics, and how you broke in, or what it takes for you to create what you create.
Well, that's a lot of questions.
It's a little broad. I left you some latitude.
How did I break into American comics? Well, I think, as I said, as a young kid, I was a DC Comics fan. They first started coming over into England in 1959, and I probably started buying them in 1960 or 61. So I was really influenced by the American comic book artists, Gil Kane, people like that. A lot of the other artists who were on the go in the early 60s were the primary influences on my work. I went through an art school system. I did a lot of stuff that you do in art schools. You know, you learn all about the history of art and everything, but it was always comics that I was really very interested in. When I became professional in British comics, there was very little to choose from, not much going on. There was war comics, there were girls' romance comics, there was football, which you'd call soccer comics, really.
Yes.
So there wasn't really an awful lot of work that I was particularly trained to do. But then 2000 AD came along, so it just enabled me, as a person who had a bit of an interest in science fiction and a kind of an American comic book influence, I was able to get that kind of work. And when Judge Dredd became quite a bit of a hit, the DC had heard of me as a consequence, and I was able to get work with DC. And I think it was because I had grown up, you know, learning to draw like the DC American comic book artist.